Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. The year 2020 brought with it the pandemic and also a change in public attitude towards tech giants like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, writes TN Nainen in his weekly column for Business Standard. Governments around the world seem set on tackling what they see as predatory business practices, tax avoidance, and misuse of data, he writes. Civil society activists, writes Nainen, fear that their outreach into new areas of potential dominance constitutes an expanding threat. There is so far limited debate in India, where virtually all these companies have teamed up in different ways with India's most powerful businessman. Did the government move on a national data boundary wall to drive them to do those multi-billion deals with Jio? He asks. Narendra Modi continues to be very popular and the BJP is still winning election after election. But in his weekly column, Shekhar Gupta argues that the index of alarm may be on an upward trajectory for Modi and BJP. Shekhar Gupta takes a look at India's tumbling ranking in various well-respected global surveys that suggest that India is sliding downwards. What explains the paradox of Modi and BJP winning while India slips downwards? It can only be reconciled if you accept that Modi and BJP have dehyphenated their vote-catching appeal from economic growth, he writes. The data now serves a warning and they may not be anywhere to hide, he concludes. The Union Finance Ministry is understandably keen on the success of its tax dispute settlement scheme, Vivad Se Vishwas. But what has drawn attention of late is the tardy progress the scheme has made so far, writes A.K. Bhattacharya in his column in Business Standard. If the government is unhappy with the scheme's performance, it should not be because its policy instrument of reducing tax arrears might fail. It should be because this could be damaging for the ruling party. So what should the government do? 1. It should avoid putting pressure on taxpayers to settle disputes on terms set out in the scheme. 2. Don't coax state-owned firms to settle disputes in the interest of minority shareholders. Finally, the Revenue Department will do well to explore another area to boost its tax collections, writes A.K. Bhattacharya. Mahesh Vyas highlights the importance of getting Indian women back into the labour force in his weekly column for Business Standard. While 67% of all men of working age are employed, only 9% of all women of working age are. This gap is a potential labour available to deploy productively in economic activities, he writes. Young women are particularly hard hit as they are compelled to juggle work with responsibilities at home and of motherhood. Their labour participation fell from 18% to nearly 10% in a year after demonetization. A promising recovery in 2019 was set back by another economic shock, the lockdown. Going by past experience, it would take a few years before this damage can be repaired, Vyas writes. In a 3-part series of columns for Business Standard, Rakesh Mohan takes a look at the ownership and governance of private sector banks. A proposal by the Internal Working Group IWG of the RBI to consider ownership of banks by large corporate or industrial houses is a reversal of long-standing policy, Mohan writes. Basic principles and international practice, such as careful scrutiny of the level of ownership by single persons or entities, suggest this should be done, if at all, with utmost caution. But why has the IWG made the controversial proposal, asks Rakesh Mohan. It is argued that India is underbanked, but the comparison is made with countries with higher per capita incomes. The comparison should be with countries with similar per capita incomes, he writes. So what now? The way forward is to clean the balance sheets of PSUs, bring down government ownership to less than 50%, bring banks under a single statute, and strengthen regulation and supervision of the financial sector as a whole, particularly banks and NBFCs, Mohan writes. The innocent until proven guilty maxim that underpins all law has been stood on its head, and it is for the individual to prove their innocence to the state, which assumes that they're guilty, writes Akar Patel in a column in Business Standard. Case in point, Uttar Pradesh's Love Jihad's law. The burden of proof has been shifted from the state to the accused. In fact, the law does not accept the testimony of an adult woman who has changed her faith after marriage as proof that no crime has been committed. The National Register of Citizens in Assam is another example. Individuals had to prove their Indian ancestry as opposed to the state identifying undocumented citizens. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act is another, often used against dissenters like Umar Khalid. The reversal of burden of proof, all aimed at a particular community, says something about us to ourselves and to the world, writes Patel. The Supreme Court's indication that it will form a committee to address the farmers' protests that have paralyzed the outskirts of the national capital is one that might in fact work and is in a way overdue. But it's a plan that should have emerged from the political leadership and not from judges, writes Business Standard in an editorial. There are disquieting elements to this development. The government should have created a structured format for discussion long ago when the farmers' protests were just getting started. Courts cannot rule on such matters. They must scrutinize if the laws have been upheld and constitutional principles satisfied. If the executive's failure to show satisfactory progress on negotiations with farmers allows the courts to open another front in the tussle between these two branches of government, then it must count as a double defeat, says the editorial. Along with higher dividend payment, public sector undertakings will now be mandatorily required to outline a plan for non-core asset monetization. On the face of it, this might sound like a reasonable ask, as selling non-core assets would help generate cash, which can be shared with the government. The problem is that the government has been squeezing PSUs for many years, says Business Standard in an editorial. The government often treats PSUs as its extension to fulfill budgetary needs. Though the circumstances in the current year are extraordinary and the government would want to raise as much resources as possible to meet its budgetary obligations, it would do well to review policies regarding PSUs with longer-term objectives in mind, says the editorial. The government's proposed sale of Air India has finally, after several abortive attempts, begun to see some forward movement. Several expressions of interest have been reportedly received, including one from the Tata Group. However, Air India must only be a beginning, writes Business Standard in an editorial. The government must begin to look around to see what else is being underutilized by public sector participation or monopoly. In May, the finance minister had talked about a policy that will make sure there is a maximum of 4 PSCs in strategic sectors while others are privatized. 7 months later, the policy is still in the works, says the editorial.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.